the ceiling cracked open like a broken promise, and in that single second, two children found themselves trapped beneath a house that was folding in on itself, and the only thing standing between them and complete disaster wasn't a firefighter or a neighbor or a parent rushing home from work. It was a 70-pound golden retriever named Cooper who had never done anything more heroic than fetch a tennis ball, but on this particular afternoon, something inside that dog woke up, and what he did next would leave an entire community in tears and force one family to rethink everything they ever believed about loyalty, love, and what it really means to be a hero. This story begins on a Tuesday that looked like any other, with morning light pouring through the windows of a small two-story home on a quiet suburban street where the Hendersons lived, a family of four with a mom who worked as a nurse and a dad who managed a warehouse across town, which meant that on most afternoons, 11-year-old Mason and 7-year-old Lily were home alone together for about 2 hours after school let out. And while some people might call that risky, Sarah Henderson knew her kids were responsible, and besides, they were never really alone because Cooper was always there waiting by the door the second they stepped off the bus, his tail wagging so hard his whole body moved with it. Cooper had been part of the family since he was 8 weeks old, a fluffy golden ball of fur that Mason had picked out from a litter on a farm about 40 miles outside of town, and from the very first night when Cooper cried in his crate and Mason snuck downstairs to sleep beside him on the cold floor, the bond between that boy and that dog was something nobody could explain but everyone could feel. Lily came along for years later, and Cooper became her shadow too, following her from room to room, laying beside her bed during thunderstorms, and somehow knowing when she had a bad day at school because he would press his warm body against her legs and just stay there until she smiled again. The kids loved Cooper more than they loved their video games, more than they loved summer vacation, and honestly, more than they probably should have loved anything at their age, but that kind of love isn't something you can measure or control, it just happens, and it sticks. On this particular afternoon, the sky outside was a strange yellowish grey, the kind of sky that makes you pause and look up for just a second before shrugging it off and going about your day, and that's exactly what Mason did when he glanced out the window while making a snack in the kitchen, not realizing that 3 miles away, a sinkhole had just opened beneath an old water main and was spreading underground at a pace nobody could have predicted. Lily was upstairs in her room playing with her stuffed animals, and Cooper was lying at the top of the stairs, his head resting on his paws, watching everything the way he always did, like a silent guardian who never clocked out. Mason had just poured himself a glass of juice when he heard a sound that made him stop mid-sip, a low rumble like a truck passing too close, but it didn't fade the way a truck would, it lingered, vibrating through the walls and into the soles of his feet. He set the glass down slowly and looked around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, and then he heard something else, a cracking noise from somewhere deep inside the house, like a piece of wood snapping under too much weight. He called out to Lily, his voice steady but edged with confusion, and she shouted back that she was fine, but then another crack came, louder this time, followed by a sound like grinding teeth coming from the floor beneath him, and that's when Cooper stood up, his ears flat, his body stiff, his eyes locked on something Mason couldn't see. The dog started barking, not his normal playful bark, but something deep and urgent, a warning, and before Mason could take a single step, the floor in the hallway between the kitchen and the stairs buckled like it was made of paper, dropping several inches and sending a shockwave through the entire structure. Mason stumbled backward and hit the counter hard, his heart slamming in his chest, and he screamed for Lily again, but this time his voice cracked with fear, and the only answer he got was the sound of something heavy falling upstairs. What Mason didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that the sinkhole had reached their block and the earth beneath their home was slowly caving in, pulling the foundation with it, and the house wasn't just settling or shifting, it was collapsing, room by room, beam by beam, in a slow and terrifying wave of destruction. The lights flickered once and then went out completely, plunging the house into a dusty grey darkness lit only by the fading daylight through the cracked windows, and Mason tried to run toward the stairs, but the floor gave way again, this time opening a jagged gap right in front of him that he couldn't cross no matter how hard he tried. He was trapped on one side, and his little sister was somewhere on the other, and in that moment of pure panic, the only thing he could do was call her name over and pray that she could hear him. Upstairs, Lily had been knocked to the floor when the first crack hit, and now she was curled up beside her bed, crying softly, too scared to move, and the walls around her were groaning like they were in pain, plaster dust falling like snow and coating her hair and her face. But then she heard something, not her brother's voice, not the cracking of the wood, but the steady click of paws on the broken floor, and when she looked up, there was Cooper standing in her doorway, his golden fur covered in grey dust, his eyes locked on hers with a focus she had never seen before. He didn't bark or whine, he just moved toward her slowly and carefully, stepping over broken pieces of drywall and around a chunk of ceiling that had fallen in the hallway, and when he reached her, he nudged her arm with his nose, pushing, urging, telling her without words that she had to get up. Lily didn't want to move, her whole body was shaking and she was too afraid to stand, but Cooper kept nudging her, harder now, his teeth gently grabbing the sleeve of her shirt and pulling, and something about that pull gave her the courage she didn't think she had. She got to her feet, still crying, still trembling, and Cooper turned and walked ahead of her toward the stairs, looking back every few steps to make sure she was following, and she was, one shaky step at a time, trusting him completely because in that moment, he was the only thing in her world that felt safe. But when they reached the staircase, Lily froze, because the top 3 steps were gone, collapsed into the gap that now separated the first floor from the second, and there was no way she could jump that distance, no way she could make it across without falling into the darkness below. Cooper looked at the gap, then back at Lily, and he did something that no one would believe later when she tried to explain it. He laid his body flat across the broken edge of the floor, pressing himself down like a bridge, like a living plank that she could use to cross. She didn't understand at first, didn't know what he was doing, but then he barked once, sharp and commanding, and she realized what he wanted her to do, and she was terrified, but she trusted him, so she climbed onto his back, her hands gripping his fur, her knees pressing into his ribs, and she crawled across his body to the other side where the stairs were still intact. Cooper pulled himself back from the edge just as another piece of the ceiling fell behind them, and together they made it down the stairs, dodging falling debris, climbing over broken furniture, until they reached the front door, which was stuck, jammed by the shifting frame of the house. Cooper threw himself against the door, again and again, his shoulder slamming into the wood until finally it burst open and they tumbled out onto the front lawn, gasping, covered in dust, but alive. Lily collapsed on the grass, sobbing, and Cooper stayed right beside her, licking her face, her hands, anything he could reach, his own body trembling now that the danger was behind him. But then Cooper lifted his head, and Lily saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop, a realization, a memory, and before she could say anything, he turned and ran back toward the house, back through the broken door, back into the collapsing nightmare they had just escaped. She screamed for him to stop, screamed for Mason, screamed for anyone, but Cooper was already gone, swallowed by the dust and shadows inside. Somewhere in the kitchen, Mason was still trapped, the gap in front of him too wide to jump, the walls around him bending and cracking, and he had given up hope, truly believed this was how it ended, when he heard the sound of paws scraping against broken tile and saw a flash of golden fur emerging from the darkness. Cooper appeared on the other side of the gap, panting, bleeding from a cut on his leg, and Mason's heart broke open because he knew what the dog was trying to do and he knew it was impossible. But Cooper didn't hesitate, he looked at the gap, looked at Mason, backed up 3 steps, and then launched himself across, his front paws catching the edge of the broken floor just barely, his back legs scrambling for grip until Mason grabbed his collar and pulled him up with strength he didn't know he had. Now they were together, but still trapped, and the ceiling above them was groaning louder than ever, ready to come down any second. Cooper started moving toward the back of the house, toward the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, and Mason followed, stepping exactly where the dog stepped, trusting him the way Lily had, until they reached the door and Mason shoved it open with both hands. They stumbled out just as the roof behind them gave way, collapsing into the kitchen with a roar that shook the ground, and Mason fell to his knees on the grass, clutching Cooper so hard he thought he might never let go, sobbing into the dog's dusty fur while Lily ran around the side of the house and threw her arms around both of them. That's where their mother found them 20 minutes later, kneeling in the backyard, covered in dirt and tears, holding onto a dog who looked like he had been through a war. But what Sarah Henderson saw when she first pulled up wasn't the miracle, it was the destruction, her home caved in, her children crying, her belongings scattered across the lawn, and in the middle of it all, the dog, standing there like a suspect at a crime scene. She didn't know what had happened, didn't understand the timeline, and in her panic and shock, she screamed at Cooper, blamed him, accused him of somehow causing this, of knocking things over, of making things worse, because the human brain does strange things when it can't process the truth. She grabbed Cooper by the collar and dragged him toward the car, saying she was taking him away, saying he was too dangerous, and Mason and Lily screamed and cried and begged her to stop, but she wasn't listening, not yet. It wasn't until Lily grabbed her mother's arm and said the words that would echo in Sarah's heart for the rest of her life that everything stopped. "Mommy, he saved us," Lily whispered, her voice broken and raw. "He came back for us. He was the only one who came back." Sarah looked at her daughter, really looked at her for the first time since arriving, and saw the dust in her hair, the scratches on her arms, the raw fear still fading from her eyes, and then she looked at Cooper, his leg still bleeding, his fur matted with debris, his eyes tired but still watching the children like a soldier who wouldn't leave his post. She let go of his collar and dropped to her knees, pulling the dog into her arms, crying into his fur, whispering apologies she couldn't say loud enough. The neighbors had gathered by then, and someone had called 911, and soon firefighters and paramedics were swarming the scene, assessing the damage and checking the children for injuries, and one by one, the pieces of the story came out: the sinkhole, the collapse, the dog who had somehow known what was coming and done what no one expected. The firefighters said that if the children had been inside even 60 seconds longer, they wouldn't have made it, that the collapse happened in stages and Cooper had navigated those stages like he had a map of the danger in his head. One paramedic knelt beside Cooper and gently bandaged his leg, whispering, "Good boy," over and over, and for the first time since everything started, Cooper's tail wagged, just a little, just enough to let everyone know he understood. That night, the Hendersons stayed with relatives, and Cooper slept between Mason and Lily, his body warm against theirs, his breathing steady and calm, and no one tried to move him, no one even suggested it. Sarah stayed awake for hours, watching the three of them from the doorway, thinking about how close she had come to blaming the very creature who had saved her children's lives, and she made a silent promise that she would never underestimate that dog again. In the weeks that followed, news of Cooper's heroism spread through the town and then beyond, picked up by local stations and shared thousands of times on social media, and people sent letters and treats and donations to help the family rebuild. But what mattered most to Mason and Lily wasn't the attention or the gifts, it was the way their mom looked at Cooper now, with respect, with gratitude, with the kind of love that doesn't need to be spoken because it's written in every glance. Cooper didn't change after that day. He still fetched the same tennis balls, still followed Lily from room to room, still laid his head on Mason's lap during movies, because that's who he was, a dog who loved his family and didn't need a reason or a reward. But everyone who knew him understood something now that they hadn't before, that love doesn't always look like grand gestures or spoken words. Sometimes it looks like a dusty golden retriever throwing himself across a gap to save a boy he couldn't leave behind. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that dogs aren't just pets but family, I want you to type the word hero in the comments right now, because Cooper earned that title and so has every dog who has ever loved without conditions. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story today, someone who loves animals or needs to believe in loyalty again, share this video with them, because stories like this deserve to be told, and love like this deserves to be remembered.